Welcome back to Simon Says. I'm Scott Simon, and I hope you enjoyed our previous episode with Jay Kirsting, another edition of Las Vegas travel tips for beginners, novices. As we talked about downtown Fremont Street, definitely look at it. The guest I'm going to have on this episode, I've got to talk him into coming out to Las Vegas pretty soon. And we hope you enjoyed that episode, and we'll have more with Jay Kirsting about Las Vegas in a couple of weeks. But at this time, for this episode, we're going to talk about a subject that you hear every day that was made famous by President Donald Trump.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
Dale Forbes is with me, and 22 years ago, he rescued me off the journalistic scrap heap when I was unemployed in St. Louis, and he had an opening on his staff in Kansas City at KMBZ Radio. He recruited me. We had a great relationship. I still consider Dale the best boss I worked for. We had fun in those 4 years in Kansas City, made a lot of good news together, and today we're going to talk about making good news or bad news, fake news. Can we define it? Is it really true? Or is it true for one genre of broadcasters and journalists and not so true for the other? Dale, I'm glad I've got you on with me, but why don't you tell our audience what you're doing now?
It's an interesting job, and unlike other jobs that I've done in the past, I've been radio news, newspaper news, television news. Right now, I write internet web content for a company called Learfield Communications, and it's basically news content for small market, medium market radio stations and newspapers, kind of an alternative to Associated Press, and it's directed to states. I do news in Wisconsin mostly, but I also do news for Missouri, Nebraska, sometimes Iowa. Great company, Learfield. I've been with them since 2001, mostly in a part-time capacity, and very interesting. The news atmosphere, the news world in the different states are dramatically different. You wouldn't believe the difference between something like Wisconsin and Missouri, and then the divisions within the state. Missouri is one state in the rural areas and an entirely different state in St. Louis and Kansas City. So it's something to do when you get too old to run around and go to news conferences.
And folks, here's some other things Dale's done in his career. He's been the news director at some pretty good radio stations. I mentioned KMBZ in Kansas City. He's also been the news director at KRMG in Tulsa. He was the news director of the Wisconsin Radio Network. You worked for Metro Networks in Florida, right?
Yes, I did. Interesting experience. I can't go into it too far because I wasn't very happy, and I don't want them to sue me.
Well, they're not in business anymore, so good luck.
Right, so
good luck to that.
should be relatively safe, shouldn't I?
Yeah, and then you ended up anchoring at KTRH in Houston. So you've worked at some pretty good places, and so you're well qualified to talk about journalism, and we're glad you're with us. So let's start out with fake news. Can you define fake news for us?
Yeah, it's anything that disagrees with Donald Trump, I guess. I think that it's a political construct. I don't know that I think that news is any less honest than it used to be, say, 5 years ago. Having said that, I will never sit down and look you in the eye and say, believe, and then name an anchor. In other words, I won't vouch for that. I have believed all of my life that news consumption works this way. You listen to multiple sources, you figure it out in your head which one makes the most sense to you, and then you follow your heart and you believe what your head and your heart tells you. Any journalist can make a mistake. I never know what another journalist's passions are or their beliefs are, and that does shade the news from time to time. And so fake news, but I'll stand by it. Yeah, fake news is somebody that says something that the president and his followers disagree with for the most part.
And my definition has the word intent in it. There has to be intent. There has to be intent for someone or a group to know something factually and intentionally publish something which opposes those facts. I never hear that word defined by anyone when they talk about this. I just hear the white noise of fake news this, fake news that, And that's the one reason why I'm doing this episode, is to define it. Now, you mentioned one word, mistake. And journalists make mistakes, and they've done so for decades, unintentionally. But that's the key word. A mistake is so much different than intent, and I think the line has been erased. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I think that to intentionally put something on the air, especially at a major network, which is false, you'd really have to passionately believe for the point of view that required you to put the false information out there, because all journalists are not liberal, no matter what they tell you. And I'm not so sure that even a majority, I think a majority of journalists don't care, that they think both sides are way off base. I one time told somebody, I thought a person who thinks that conservatives are right all the time, and I'm a registered Republican who hasn't voted for a Democrat since 1992. But I think somebody that thinks conservatives and Republicans are right all the time lacks judgment. You know, there have been, one side isn't right all the time. My frustration with politics today and the accusations thrown at journalists is that both sides sit there and say, well, the Democrats are evil, the Democrats are terrible. And then the Democrats say the Republicans are evil, the Republicans are terrible. And in general, they're both right. You know, I backed away. I don't consider myself a Republican anymore. Fake news, what frustrates me, Scott, is while we were doing the news together, I always felt like I could figure out who was right. I always felt like I could figure out where the truth was. I don't feel like I can do that anymore.
Really? Even at the local level, because I want to talk about local versus network in a second.
Well, local level, there's not nearly as much knee-jerk politics. Mm-hmm. For instance, the people who were just ripping John McCain to shreds, mostly because he voted against Donald Trump issues, more than anything else. You know, I wasn't one who fawned all over John McCain and thought he was one. I did vote for him for president. I voted for him with great trepidation because I didn't trust his running mate to do the right thing. But I don't know that I think he walked on water.
Right.
You know, I respect his military service. I respect the things that he went through. And I always loved politicians who were willing to walk across the aisle and agree with the other guy when they thought the other guy was right. One of my favorite politicians in history is John Danforth of Missouri. He was a billionaire, therefore he was not beholden to anybody. And if he thought the Democrats were right, as a Republican, he would vote on the Democratic side. I appreciated that. I want my politicians to do what's right for the country. We don't give them the incentive to do that, Scott. The only incentive we give them is to get reelected.
I'm glad you shared about who you voted for president in 2008, because when I worked for you, I covered full-time a mayor in Kansas City who's now a congressman and fairly well known because he does appear nationally on some news programs, Emanuel Cleaver, who's a Democrat. And I enjoyed covering him immensely because he was fair and always answered the question. And I enjoy his interviews that he does on Fox News Network and Fox Business Channel with Neil Cavuto, who probably is a Republican. I don't know, but it definitely is. So, yeah. Definitely more of a Republican-leaning channel. And those two get along famously. So, I mean, there can be some bipartisanship if the moniker can stick between journalist and newsmaker. But when we come back from the commercial, Dale, that's when we're going to define the difference between local and network in terms of culture. So Dale Forbes is with us, and we're going to be back after the commercial talking about fake news, trying to define it. This is going to be a 3-part series. We have a couple more interviews extended out there in interview land. We'll be telling you about in a couple of weeks. But first, we want to hear this word from our sponsor, doTERRA Essential Oils. Your wellness consultants are Jay and Kathy Kirsting. I have personal experience myself with doTERRA Essential Oils. Last year, I was stricken with a heart attack, ended up in a hospital for a month and a half. And when I came out of a coma, I was groggy, I wasn't alert, and Jay Kirsting brought by a vial of wild orange essential oil from doTERRA. And day by day, I could see that I was becoming more alert. And it really did work. And it worked for Jay. That's how he got to be a doTERRA Essential Oils consultant. Here's his story about what doTERRA Essential Oils did for him.
I got involved because I was having a real issue, and this may surprise some. I've spent a number of years in broadcasting, and I was under so much stress that I was unable to speak almost nonstop. That was me. I couldn't get a thought out. My wife reached out to a friend of ours and said, Stephanie, maybe you've got something, let's try it. She presented us with this essential oil called Balance. And all this one I did was I rubbed it on my hands and I inhaled it. So I would just put my hands over my nose and I would inhale it. And within a couple of days, I was back to speaking normally again.
So we're coming up on the holiday season. If you're looking for a great gift idea for someone, contact Jay and Kathy Kirsting for doTERRA Essential Oils. You can go to their website, jkirsting.com, and there's a link there to their doTERRA products. There's many of them to choose from. Take your time and get something for yourself. After all, if you're happy, everyone else is happy. Welcome back to Simon Says. Dale Forbes joins us. We're talking about fake news. Dale and I work together in local news. We've worked in local news for years. We've never worked in network news. And so I think we have to start drawing the line for listeners who don't really know the difference between local and network. There is a major cultural difference between what we did in a market like Kansas City, or when I worked in St. Louis, or when you worked in Tulsa and Houston. Our mentality is a lot different than those who work at the network in New York City.
Yeah, it is. We know the local people much better. I know about 15 to 20 people who work for the major networks, the ABCs and the NBCs, and they started there too, and they have commented to me before the different pressures that they have felt. They had one friend of mine, who I'll just call by his first name, Pete, has told me how many times he's been blasted for one of his stories where the person blasting him will admit that it was accurate.
Oh, wow.
But they're saying, well, but you're destroyed. I am for the pure point of view. My point of view is right. Therefore, you should never run a story ever that hurts my effort to promote goodness. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. We're not talking, we don't advocate. We're journalists. We just want to be accurate. That's all I've ever really wanted to be is accurate. I don't expect approval. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to make you happy when I do my story. I kind of regret about, 15 years ago, I was working in Madison with the radio network there. And at one point there was this sweet little old lady who was a state she was a state senator. And she was telling me how much she appreciated our efforts and what a good job we did. And at one point in the interview, I said, well, I'm not trying to make friends with politicians. I said, I like you and respect you, but I'm not trying to promote your cause. And later I felt bad because I felt like I kind of slapped her in the face, Scott. I felt like I kind of pushed her away, and it wasn't that. I was just trying to be honest.
Well, you were honest, but I'll tell you what, that is the natural reaction that a journalist gets with newsmakers. After a while, you hang around journalists so much, we do this for this cause, and you build up that bunker mentality that when you interact with somebody like that, it's almost a natural response, and then you go back and says, you know what, I'm really a human being before I'm a journalist. So yeah, it happens.
Well, I mean, it's not that hard to keep your personal feelings out of your journalistic work if you're professional. You find a couple of sources. I'm willing for an interview source to talk me out of my point of view. Maybe I'm wrong. I have come to believe that climate change is true. What I haven't come to believe is that man causes it. Every time I've interviewed somebody, when I ask them, well, tell me, tie it up for me, show me, I'm a layman, I'm not a scientist, show me how man causes climate change by numbers or by chemistry or by whatever makes you happy. And boy, you'd be surprised, Scott, how many times, well, they have an appointment, they got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Those who tell you that 97% of scientists support climate change, that's a lie. It's a lie. I was working for a conservative radio station. I was encouraged to give both sides of that debate, both sides of that story, and I had no problem finding scientists who don't believe in climate change. Again, this is said by a guy who believes it's true. I'm buying it. The ocean is rising. About what is it? I think you and I were joking about it one time. And I said, well, in 400 years, when there's I don't know what that was. In 400 years, when there's 6 inches of water in downtown Miami, then we'll know it was true.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Climate change. Hey, I always thought it was cow flatulence myself, but hey, I could be proven wrong.
Yeah, I'm open to that. I'm not a scientist. I wasn't really very good in physical science when I was in college, but you're right. No, there is a different culture, and the people who try to pressure you, I don't know any way to put it other than to say they may be a little more scary.
Mm-hmm.
When the head of the Chamber of Commerce tries to pressure you to run a story, you blow him off if it's not right. But when the head of the American Red Cross pressures you to run a story, it's a little different. So I don't know if they blink in the face of pressure. I would imagine they probably do. I think the liberalness of reporters is vastly overstated, but I do think that network reporters don't like Republicans. I just don't think it's because they're Democrats. I think they don't like Republicans because Republicans have been calling them dishonest for 45 years.
Well,
I'm not sure what Republicans expect.
I don't know. All I know is Donald Trump continues to harp on the New York Times and Washington Post. Now, these are local newspapers with national influence.
Right.
We talk about network broadcasting versus local broadcasting. Let's take a look at the newspaper industry. You have the New York Times, the Washington Post, with declining circulation, but still with a national presence only because they staff Washington, D.C. and New York City like nobody else in the newspaper business, and they have that kind of influence. So he's harping on them about their fake news. Is he harping on them, considering them a national voice or a local voice? I think he's calling them a national voice, and I really wonder how influential the New York Times and Washington Post really are.
Well, in New York and Washington, I would say very influential.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you get much past Ohio, I don't think anybody in Springfield, Missouri cares what the New York. I shouldn't say anybody.
Right, but very few.
But you could put them around the table in the Pizza Hut. I mean, it's not that influential. I think there are some funny dynamics with that, though. For instance, I think if Donald Trump hadn't been elected president, I think MSNBC might be out of business by now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think CNN would be on the ropes by now. Both of them have really been boosted by essentially assuming a posture against the president. Well, Scott, you and I both know that's not journalism.
No.
That's entertainment, or that is content for on air. But if you take a position, you're no longer a journalist.
Well, and then down the road, I'm going to have you back on. We're going to talk about talking heads versus real journalists, because people have erased that line too. They think a talking head like Don Lemon, is a journalist. And Don Lemon at one time, I think he was at Channel 2 in St. Louis when you were at KTRS Radio in St. Louis.
Could have been, I think so.
And I know journalists in Lebanon, Missouri, who are better than he is, because he came into St. Louis for Ferguson, Missouri's riots 4 years ago. He worked in the market, and then he started talking about the geography and where you go to get from here to here to here, and he got it wrong.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that down the road. Now, here's a question. In in local news, do you know of any example, either firsthand or have heard it firsthand from somebody close to you, of a local journalist deliberately creating fake news at the local level?
I don't. I've heard allegations before, but every time you checked into it, you found out that it wasn't true. So honestly, no. I know of probably 10,000 times when a local journalist got a story wrong, got a fact wrong.
Like me.
But well, I wasn't going to say that. Listen, pal. There are just as many of those red marks under my name. I know about that, but as far as somebody specifically setting out to get somebody else, I bet it has happened, but I don't know about it. Because
of the word intent. I don't know if anybody at the local level really has in their nomenclature, can I really intentionally do something? Like we said, the local culture is so much different than the network culture. Now, I'll ask you this. As you look at national news, and let's just say the last 5 to 10 years, or maybe even 15, is there a story or stories that stood out and you saw it and you said, this is fake news? I know it's fake news.
Yeah, there are stories on both sides. There are. Matter of fact, you don't have to go back 5 years. You can go back 60 years. I think Murrow went after McCarthy. I think he decided McCarthy was a bad guy, and he went to get him. He was probably right. Mm-hmm. Maybe McCarthy got what he deserved, but again, I think it was point of view.
Right.
And Murrow was an incredible journalist who was held up as an icon for all of us to live up to. But we all, it's not unusual that it would happen. Lately, I think when the some of the stories from 20 years ago on Donald Trump or other politicians, but specifically him, when they're your lead story at 6 o'clock, that's kind of point of view journalism. We don't evaluate the true impact anymore. That's just searching for slime on a political candidate you don't like. Right. It's not necessarily lying. It's not necessarily fake news, but it certainly isn't journalism.
Here, I'm going to give you my example, and then you tell me if you agree or disagree. My spotlight on fake news was the George Bush National Guard story with CBS News and Dan Rather. And it ended up costing Rather his job and the producer as well. I believe that's a real true definition of fake news because they had been told all along this and that. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I'm less emphatic than you are, and here's why. I think those two, Rather and his producer, lost their jobs than they should have. I think they trusted the wrong guy and presented as fact something that they didn't really know was fact. On the other hand, I think, is that me doing that or you? Can you even hear that?
Yeah, no, I didn't hear it. But you were fine.
Okay, maybe anyway, I think there's a good chance that what they presented was probably true. I think rich guy Bush probably avoided some of his duty. Uh-huh. But having said that, they didn't have the facts to back the story. They should not have run the story.
No.
So yeah, it qualifies as fake news. There's a lot of stuff out there that is passed off as fact today, Scott, that isn't really fact. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it, I mean, for instance, Donald Trump has really, really been good for the economy. The unemployment rate is the lowest it's been since 2000. When Bill Clinton was president, it was 3.9% then too. But at the same time, we talk about him rescuing the economy and just for kicks. I went to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Yeah, this is the kind of life I live. I'm sorry, folks. I'm boring. But I went online, and if you project this year, which is a really good year, if you project it out, then Donald Trump's administration will have developed 4.7 million new jobs in his first 2 years in office. Do you know how many new jobs were developed in the last 2 years Barack Obama was in office?
No, tell me.
4.4 million.
Okay.
Wall Street jumped 31.7% in Donald Trump's first year in office, and that is wonderful, and that's great performance, and he should get credit for that. Mm-hmm. Do you know how much he jumped in Barack Obama's last year in office? 25.7%.
Yeah, it did.
So,
It did go up significantly.
So, is he better at developing the economy than Barack Obama? Yes. Did Barack Obama's momentum fall into follow Donald Trump into office? No, because momentum doesn't last that long on Wall Street. An economist one time told me that if it happened more than 6 months ago, it's doing nothing to Wall Street right now, and I kind of believe that. I don't know that, I'm not an economist, so maybe he was wrong, but I don't think, when Barack Obama comes out as he did last week and says, well, the economy's strong, but it's only because of what I did. No, I don't really believe that.
Well, guess what? Because you just did such a great job segueing into what I have to say in response to what you did. They're talking about the current president and the previous president. Upcoming in probably a couple of weeks, we're going to have Rob Plaza back on. He's the senior advisor to Key Private Bank in Cleveland. He's frequently on CNBC. And we're going to talk about Nike and whether or not spot news like Colin Kaepernick has a real effect on the stock. So thank you for segueing into that promo for a future edition of Simon Says.
Is my check in the mail? There's some kind of promotional contract here, right?
That's right, $1.27. We have a big budget here.
I'll look for it.
Okay,
That's
well,
good.
Wrapping this up, fake news. I don't see it going away. I see the white noise continuing at the same pace, maybe getting a little louder as elections draw near. Right?
You're exactly right. There's too much ground to be made. There's too much value in presenting things that aren't true. I don't know I'm necessarily talking about. I think there's a lot more fake news when you read Facebook. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on there that just isn't even close to being true, and people buy it hook, line, and sinker. But yeah, it'll continue for the rest of our lives and get uglier and uglier probably.
Well, Dale,
Dale,
where can people go online to read your type of news, right? Or can they?
They can't. I'm sorry. It's a secured website. The radio stations and newspapers literally buy a subscription in order to use it.
Okay. So you're lurking in the weeds.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am twisting little minds in Southwest Wisconsin even as we speak. I lived in Wisconsin for 5 years. That's why I live in San Antonio now, but that's why I do Wisconsin news, is because I lived there for a long time and I know newsmakers and I know sources and stuff like that. And I guess I'll keep doing it. I like working out of my home.
Well, I always like the slogan line about you, what you said about yourself. I hear things, I tell people. I always thought that was the best description.
That's right. That's what a journalist does. To check your facts, try to be accurate. Please, consumers, listen to multiple sources and then make up your own mind. And if I'm wrong, don't think I'm trying to lead you wrong. I'm just a human being who believed the wrong person.
And when we have Dale back in the future, we're also going to talk about news writing and how poor it is. And maybe Dale will jump on my bandwagon that I've been on for the past 10 years. I wish that broadcasters, even print journalists, would quit using this phrase, non-life-threatening injuries. Nobody talks like that at Starbucks or the Quaff Bar in downtown Kansas City. It's ridiculous, and I'm tired of it.
My favorite word is slay. You don't say, well, 3 people were slayed last night. Did you hear about that, Bob, while you're over a pizza and a beer? You just don't say that. And somebody said, well, why do they use the word slay? And I said, because when newspapers put it in a headline, the L was a half count. Okay. So they could fit more words in the space they had to write a headline. It's a newspaper headline word. Nobody else uses it.
Well, and then my pet peeve for the last 10 years has been homicide. I think we've been homicided to death by the media. Somebody's murdered on the street and it says, it's another homicide, and I'm sitting there going, nobody uses that word in general conversation.
I will defend that word to a point. You're right, most states. In Wisconsin, the charge literally is intentional homicide. Right. In Missouri, you're charged with murder.
Sure.
In other states, you're charged with murder. But in Wisconsin, homicide really is a term. But what you're seeing in news writing there, Scott, is they're just mimicking what the police officer said, or what the prosecutor said. They're not talking the way Bob down at the bar talks. Not that I hang out in bars that much. They're talking the way Barney Fife talked when he read it off of a release. at the office. And really good journalists need to write in a way that people will understand what they're talking about. And that's not necessarily cop speak.
Well,
nobody calls kids juveniles except for cops.
Right. Well, it's the formal title versus general conversation. Like you said, if somebody is murdered in Wisconsin and they're charged, it's homicide. It's a formal title. It's set aside. But when you're talking about, an event or an activity that's not formal, you don't say, "Hey Joe, did you hear somebody so and so was homicided last night?" No, they were murdered. So
it's not a verb. That's right. Exactly right.
Well, Dale, thanks for being with us. I'm glad that you started off this 3-part series as we attempted to find fake news. We've got a couple more interviews to reach out there, and we want to keep on this topic because we do want to bring people into the circle of journalists and interact on a topic they hear about, but oftentimes say, "I don't have a chance to say anything about it." So thank you for being with me on this.
Oh, listen, thank you for having me on, my friend.
Dale Forbes with us. He is one of the best news writers in the United States. He does it for Learfield Communications, for their network of stations. He has been a news director of big stations like KRMG Tulsa, KMBZ Kansas City, KTRS St. Louis, the Wisconsin Radio Network. We don't have pikers on this show. We have real folks telling real stories. I'm Scott Simon, Simon Says, and stay tuned. We're going to talk more about fake news with other interviews coming up in the next couple of months. So until then, so long from the greatest city in the United States, Las Vegas, Nevada.